If you attacked this dinosaur, you were going to regret it in 1 second. Picture the scene. It is the late Cretaceous, maybe 70 million years ago, in what is now Montana. The air is thick and smells like pine sap and stagnant swamp water. Everything is huge. Everything is dangerous. And then there is the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps, a rumbling that feels less like an animal walking and more like a tank idling. That is your introduction to Ankylosaurus magniventris. And if you are a predator, a big one, a nightmare engine like Tyrannosaurus rex, this particular rumbling sound means one of two things: lunch or sudden, violent regret. Spoiler alert, 9 times out of 10, it was the regret. Ankylosaurus was not just a dinosaur. It was a commitment. It was a 6-ton walking fortress engineered by evolution specifically to say no. It was a lowrider built out of solid bone, muscle, and malice. It was the living definition of an absolute unit.
Short legs, wide hips, and a silhouette that screamed, "I dare you to try it." I want to spend a long time talking about this animal because it represents peak defensive evolution. We talk a lot about speed, size, and jaw power, but we rarely appreciate the sheer brutal effectiveness of passive defense taken to its logical extreme. Ankylosaurus means fused lizard, and that name is a massive understatement. This creature was not just covered in armor, the armor was part of the creature. It was tectonic plate on legs. Let's start with the skin, or rather what replaced the skin. The problem of predation and the solution of plate armor. The late Cretaceous was not a safe place to be a large, slow-moving vegetarian. Every corner of the ecosystem was patrolled by gigantic theropods, things with banana-sized teeth and the motivation of being perpetually hungry.
If you couldn't outrun them, and Ankylosaurus absolutely could not, you had to devise a system where being eaten was geometrically impossible. And evolution, bless its heart, delivered. The armor of the Ankylosaurus was an extensive, complicated system of dermal ossifications called osteoderms. Think of them like specialized bone growths that formed within the skin itself, rather than being attached to the underlying skeleton. They started small, perhaps just nodular bumps, but as the dinosaur grew, these structures expanded, thickened, and eventually fused together to create the infamous shield. It wasn't uniform either. That's what's crucial. This wasn't just a turtle shell. It was a highly specialized articulated combat suit. The plates varied dramatically across the body. Over the back, you had large keeled scutes, sometimes flat, sometimes peaked like little mountain ranges, all set in a tough, leathery matrix. These scutes were not flimsy.
The outer surface was highly porous and likely covered in a layer of keratin, like an armored lizard scale the size of a dinner plate, adding a final, slick, and incredibly resilient layer. This deep texture is what makes the fossils so compelling. When you look at a complete Ankylosaurus carapace, you don't see smoothness. You see ridges, bumps, valleys, and sharp points, all engineered to deflect, absorb, and shatter impact energy. If a tyrannosaur bit down on one of those keeled scutes, the force would be distributed across the curved surface, often resulting in nothing more than a dull ache in the predator's jaw and maybe a chipped tooth. That's a bad trade-off for the hunter. The arrangement was ingenious. Across the spine, the largest plates were set firmly, like cobblestones, providing maximum protection for the vital organs, the heart, the lungs, the major blood vessels. But around the flanks and shoulders, where the animal needed to bend or shift slightly, the osteoderms were smaller and more densely packed, allowing for minimal flexibility without compromising defense. It was a chainmail made of bone. And I mean seriously, the commitment to defense was total. We are not just talking about the back here. The head, for instance, the skull of Ankylosaurus was a single, fused, almost featureless dome of bone. Unlike most dinosaurs, whose skull bones were joined by movable sutures, the Ankylosaurus had ossified every connection. The skull itself was wider than it was long, shaped like a massive medieval helmet. Even the plates that protected the cheeks, the squamosals and the orbitals, were extended outward into menacing triangular horns. It had massive bony shutters protecting its face, like a bunker looking out onto a war zone. And yes, I know what you're thinking. What about the eyes?
Even those were partially protected by plates that extended over the orbit, limiting visibility slightly perhaps, but making sure a stray swipe from a giant claw didn't take out its optical sensors. The neck, a typical vulnerability for any terrestrial animal, was shielded by a specialized structure called the cervical half-ring. This was a crescent of fused bone, often studded with large conical spikes, sitting right behind the head, covering the nape and the major arteries running to the brain. To even attempt a kill shot on an Ankylosaurus, a predator would have to navigate through feet of solid muscle, several inches of dermal bone, and a layer of dense keratin, all while dealing with a 6-ton animal that was not happy about being bothered. The entire structure was designed to maximize survivability by minimizing target area. Because it was so low to the ground, maybe only 5 feet high at the shoulder, a predator couldn't easily grip it.
There were no soft points on the top or sides. This meant the only way to kill an Ankylosaurus was to flip it over. The underbelly problem and the posture solution. Every armored animal has an Achilles heel, and for the Ankylosaurus, it was its soft, unarmored belly. But the animal knew this. Every aspect of its anatomy was geared toward preventing the predator from ever getting a look at the vulnerable underside. First, the stance. Ankylosaurus had extremely short, robust limbs, slightly outward, giving it a low center of gravity. It was built like a battle tank, heavy and stable. Trying to hook a paw or a jaw under its belly required getting extremely low, which put the predator directly into range of its ultimate weapon. Second, the behavior. Paleontologists theorize that when threatened, the Ankylosaurus didn't run, it hunkered down. It pressed its belly low into the mud or the substrate, creating a tight seal.
This move turned the 6-ton dinosaur into an impenetrable dome. A T-Rex trying to get its jaws under that tight seal would be trying to lift 6 metric tons of bone and muscle while fighting against friction. It would be like trying to flip a boulder that was actively trying to resist you. Imagine the frustration. A top-tier predator, capable of crushing bone with a single bite, facing a walking meatball that just hunkered down and waited for the fight to end itself. The predator would eventually have to decide, is this meal worth shattering my teeth and risking massive injury? Which brings me to the injury risk, because the Ankylosaurus had one more massive, decisive argument built into its biology. The Cretaceous sledgehammer, anatomy of the tail club. If the armor was the defense, the tail club was the judicial system. It was the absolute final word in any argument, and that word was violence. The tail of the Ankylosaurus, unlike the tails of most other dinosaurs, which were long, flexible balancers, was specialized into 2 distinct sections. The proximal section, the part closest to the body, was incredibly muscular and still somewhat flexible, necessary for generating the swing. But the distal section, the final half of the tail, was rigid. It was peak structural engineering. The final caudal vertebrae were deeply interlocking and often fused together by ossified tendons. These tendons were essentially strips of bone woven along the spine, turning the last few feet of the tail into a single, unyielding rod. This rod was the handle for the club, and the club itself was 2 to 4 massive fused osteoderms, pure, dense, unapologetic bone. It was huge. We're talking about a structure that could be 3 feet wide and weigh over 100 pounds, a solid mass of calcium phosphate swung at high velocity. This is where the engineering gets scary.
When an Ankylosaurus swung its tail, it was not just swishing a weight. It was employing basic physics to deliver a catastrophic blow. The ossified tendon structure acted like a spring, storing energy during the windup and snapping the club forward. The speed at the tip of that club relative to the pivot point, the hips, must have been immense. Studies on the biomechanics of the Ankylosaurus tail club have compared its striking force to high-impact implements. We are talking about forces that exceed anything generated by modern martial arts experts or even specialized industrial equipment. One estimate suggested the impact force was easily capable of shattering bone, not just a light fracture, but a clean, complete break of a large bone like a tibia or a femur. The Ankylosaurus tail was essentially a massive, reinforced wrecking ball attached to the world's most powerful spring, operated by a 6-ton armored meatball. And believe me, I have thought about this too much. The club was perfectly positioned to strike the low-hanging legs or ankles of large predators. Remember, the Ankylosaurus was low to the ground. A T-Rex, standing maybe 12 feet tall at the hip, had a massive target area right where its weight-bearing structures, its knees and ankles, were located. The entire defensive strategy was, you try to eat me, you will leave here permanently crippled. It was the ultimate deterrence. This animal wasn't designed to win fights, it was designed to ensure that the predator loses its ability to hunt ever again. A T-Rex with a broken ankle is a dead T-Rex, eventually. The stakes were absolute. Who were the fools brave enough or hungry enough to try and breach the Ankylosaurus fortress? In the ecosystems where Ankylosaurus lived, specifically the Hell Creek and Lance formations, the primary threat was obviously Tyrannosaurus rex. But you also had other large theropods, like the smaller but swift Nanotyrannus, if you accept that as a valid genus, and various dromaeosaurs, though they were mostly nuisance pests rather than existential threats. The real conflict was the T-Rex versus the tank. It's the matchup everyone pictures, and it's the one that reveals the genius of the Ankylosaurus design. Let's talk strategy. As mentioned, the only viable attack vector was the underside. This required precision, speed, and brute strength. A T-Rex would likely approach rapidly, maybe trying to use its massive head to push the Ankylosaurus off balance or grab a limb. However, the short legs and wide stance made grabbing the limbs difficult and risky. If the T-Rex missed the limb and its head dropped too low, it would be in the kill zone of the tail club. Early paleontologists sometimes theorized that the club was primarily for intraspecies combat, rival males fighting over territory or mating rights. While this might have been a secondary use, the evidence strongly suggests its primary purpose was defense against massive predators. We have found fossil evidence, specifically on related ankylosaurids, showing damage to the plates consistent with massive bite marks. And we have also found club damage on other ankylosaurid fossils, indicating the force was necessary for defense or serious combat. One particularly fascinating piece of evidence comes from a specimen of the related dinosaur Euoplocephalus. Its fossil plates show clear puncture wounds, perfectly spaced to match the teeth of a large tyrannosaur. But here's the kicker. The bone had healed. The tyrannosaur bit it, failed to penetrate the vitals, and the armored animal survived the attack. The armor worked. It took the hit and kept on living. This tells you exactly what kind of battle the Ankylosaurus was fighting. It was a war of attrition, not speed. The predator's life was a constant calorie crunch. Missing a kill meant wasted energy. Getting injured meant starvation. If a T-Rex encountered an Ankylosaurus, it would have to calculate the potential return on investment versus the risk of having its shin bone reduced to gravel. Think about the psychological effect too. A T-Rex probably learned very quickly which shape of animal was worth the effort and which shape was absolutely not. The broad, low-slung, spiked silhouette became synonymous with pain. This wasn't prey. This was a weapon you had to disarm before you could eat it, and disarming it was harder than disarming a nuclear warhead. Discarded theories and deep time. For a long time, the details of Ankylosaurus's biology were murky, based mostly on fragmented fossils. For instance, the exact configuration of the osteoderms and spikes was debated. Were they all erect and sharp like a classic illustration, or were they more flattened and embedded? Modern analysis, including CT scans of the skull and bone histology, shows the incredibly complex integration of the armor into the musculature. This was not haphazard. The patterns of spikes and scutes formed a cohesive system, maximizing coverage while shedding weight where possible, though admittedly the Ankylosaurus was still a hefty beast. Another theory concerned the ankylosaurid family tree itself. You have two main branches of armored dinosaurs, the nodosaurids and the ankylosaurids. Nodosaurids, like Edmontonia or Sauropelta, were generally more than lacked the tail club, but had massive outward-pointing shoulder spikes. They were the original spiked tanks. The ankylosaurids, which includes Ankylosaurus, evolved later and decided that the best defense was a good offense combined with superior plating. They traded the huge shoulder spikes for the massive cranial armor and the bone-crushing tail club. It's an evolutionary arms race in fast forward.
The predators get bigger jaws, so the prey gets thicker armor. The predators figure out they need to go for the legs, so the prey weaponizes the tail. The Ankylosaurus was the final, devastating answer in that particular sequence of events. It was the endpoint of defensive specialization. It was slow, maybe only moving at a casual jog, but it didn't need speed. It had permanence. It had structural integrity. The attack, the scenario no T-Rex wanted. Let's play out the confrontation, the scene that would have played out across the late Cretaceous forests and floodplains. A large, mature T-Rex, maybe a female, 40 feet long, spots the Ankylosaurus grazing peacefully on ferns and low-lying vegetation. The Ankylosaurus doesn't seem concerned. It's eating, but its low-slung head is constantly scanning, its position never changing much. The T-Rex initiates the charge. The earth shakes. The Ankylosaurus does not bolt.
It lowers itself further, digging its short toes and heavy bulk into the soft ground. It pulls its head back, shielded by that massive, bony cowl. It presents nothing but fused bone and sharp edges. The T-Rex stops short, maybe 15 feet away. It circles. The massive head dips down, sniffing the heavy armor, trying to find a gap, a chink in the plating. The air is tense, silent except for the harsh, ragged breathing of the carnivore. The T-Rex knows the drill. It needs to get leverage. It needs to apply force high up on the carapace and flip the entire body over, exposing the organs. It lunges quickly, not for a bite, but for a massive shove with its snout and shoulder, aiming to destabilize the Ankylosaurus. Contact, a massive impact that rattles the forest. But the Ankylosaurus barely budges. Its low center of gravity and planted feet absorb the kinetic energy. The T-Rex feels the dull resistance of bone against bone, maybe even a slight sting as its jaw brushes against a sharp peripheral scute. The push fails. The T-Rex tries again, pivoting, maybe aiming for the head, too heavily armored. It snaps down on the side, a 12,000 pound per square inch bite force focused on a section of flank plating. The keratin layer splinters, the underlying bone cracks slightly, but the bite depth is shallow. The vital organs are still yards away behind layers of muscle and bone. The T-Rex has wasted effort and risked its teeth, which, remember, don't grow back quickly. The Ankylosaurus has remained stubbornly still, patient. It knows the T-Rex's focus is on the front half. The predator, frustrated, circles wide, trying to flank the beast. It takes a calculated risk, moving into the direct path of the tail. It figures if it can quickly disable a leg with a snap bite, the armor will be useless. The T-Rex steps in, fast and decisive, focusing on the left hind leg. But the Ankylosaurus doesn't wait for the strike. It senses the shift in weight and angle. The massive muscles in its hips and tailbase contract violently. The stiff, rod-like section of the tail whips around with dizzying speed. The sound is horrifying. It is the sound of heavy wood splintering, amplified by the immense density of the bone. The club connects, not with the meat of the leg, but with the lateral surface of the T-Rex's tibia or ankle joint. The force is instant and overwhelming. The 6-ton impact is transferred straight through the bone. The T-Rex's lower leg buckles laterally, shattered. The predator doesn't roar. It makes a sharp, strangled noise of absolute shock and agony. It crashes forward, all balance lost, its massive head slamming into the ground, grinding its teeth against the dirt. The Ankylosaurus watches for a moment, repositioning its tail, ready for a second swing if needed.
The T-Rex, now completely crippled, drags its massive body away, leaving a smear of blood and a broken bone career in the dust. The fight is over. It's not a glorious victory for the Ankylosaurus. It's a simple, pragmatic statement. I am not worth it. That is the power of this biological weapon, the ultimate self-defense mechanism. It was not a fast kill, but a guaranteed, life-altering, disabling blow. A T-Rex that survived a clean strike from an Ankylosaurus was one that learned a permanent, painful lesson about respecting the armored tanks of the Cretaceous. The Ankylosaurus probably just went back to grazing, the perfect illustration of evolution, focusing all its energy, not on offense, but on enduring. It was a specialist in survival. It mastered the geometry of pain. It's tempting to think of the age of dinosaurs as being all about speed and terrifying aggression, but sometimes the quietest, heaviest guy in the room is the one you need to watch out for.
Ankylosaurus was the immovable object, and in the late Cretaceous, few, if any, predatory forces could be considered the unstoppable force against it. It stands as a testament to the extremes nature will go to just to keep an organism alive. It was peak structural integrity, peak defensive posture, and peak I don't care what you brought to the fight. You simply cannot get through this. A legend built from bone and sheer nope. If you dug this deep dive into the engineering genius of the Ankylosaurus, do me a favor and smash that like button. Seriously, help me get this channel out there. And subscribe so you don't miss the next time I break down a creature that evolution clearly had too much fun designing. Thanks for watching, and until next time on The Lost World.